Okay, just posting some post-read thoughts that I thought of. I just finished reading, or I guess I finished reading this about a week ago, but I'm just getting around now to getting my thoughts out there. This is a great improvisation by Stacy Schiff. It's Franklin, France, and the Birth of America. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really good. I think it got off to a bit of a slow and kind of a rocky start, and I was a little bit I don't know the word. I just wasn't like really that into it the first like 100 pages or so, and then it kind of turns a corner at the turning point of the Revolutionary War, and then I think it's pretty amazing from from there on in till the very end of the book. So like the title suggests, I mean, Franklin is very much at the center of the story, but really what it's about is it's just about like the burgeoning alliance, the Franco-American alliance during the Revolutionary War and kind of all that that entails. And where I think the book struggles at times is I think it can't decide if it wants to be fully about Franklin or if it wants to just be about, the creation of this alliance, because there were a lot of other factors and a lot of other people involved in addition to just Franklin. So for the first 100 pages, when Silas Deane is really like the first representative from, the colonies in France, but this is well before France is willing to officially recognize the U.S. as a nation and is not willing to publicly support the colonies. There's a lot of like covert, like they issue loans covertly. There's a lot of like individual, like private profiteers or merchants that are willing to still make deals and send munitions and weapons and uniforms and other things like that back to the colonies, which is essential in the war effort for the colonists, because there were times when it was extremely dire for them. And this, I thought, kind of was that back and forth the first 100 pages where it was a little bit hard to follow because there wasn't like, again, official I guess Versailles just like was not officially willing to get involved at this point. So it was a little bit more covert. I think it was a little more like abstract and harder to follow with kind of how some of these individual merchants were doing stuff and how Silas Deane was a part of it and stuff like that. And then also like introducing Franklin, because he eventually will be appointed and sent as, one of the three representatives to try and draw France into an official alliance with the colonies. But before he like gets there and gets fully involved in everything, the author, like, she tries to still talk a lot about Franklin and like his personality, his background and stuff like that. And I think the two things, like Silas Deane and what he's doing versus like introducing Franklin, are kind of at odds for a bit. The turning point, like I said, is about the 100-page mark after the Battle of Saratoga, which finally convinces the French crown, through particularly the Comte de Vergennes, to get involved in the war and officially declare the United States a sovereign nation, and officially from the royal ministry's perspective, finally officially backing the American cause. That's when I think it starts to get, it kind of picks up its speed. It's easier to follow a lot of the actions that take place from that point. And I think that's where it starts to get a little bit more compelling. And because that's essentially where, even though there's still a lot of struggle, and I think that's a big part of it, when the war effort there really kicks up, that's when, like more loans start going out. That's when there's bigger need for things on behalf of the Continental Army at that point. And also that kind of coincides with when Silas Deane is recalled, because there was some suspicion about him kind of personally profiting from a lot of this, like, again, the kind of covert, like, private profiteers that were sending stuff to the colonists and things like that. And there were some investigations into potential wrongdoing on his part. And then, of course, famously, John Adams will replace Silas Deane, which is when I think the story gets really interesting, because Adams and Franklin just had such different approaches to dealing with the French, and I don't think either one is particularly right or wrong. I think it just represents kind of like different strategies when it comes to diplomacy, and that's what I think makes this story so interesting. Franklin was obviously like just revered in French society because of his scientific renown. I think he was, I mean, really seen as like the first American, but seeing, I think that they brought a lot of these like ideals of the Enlightenment, which are starting to kind of, spread throughout France at the time. He kind of represents that from the New World, coming over to the Old World, and the scientific community and so many others are just completely infatuated with him. His tactic with Vergennes and with the French was basically he wanted the alliance to stay like as strong as it could possibly be, which meant in some cases basically just letting the French kind of have their way, being almost a pacifist, never really forcing the issue, which then John Adams will kind of lambast him for being way too passive and actually not kind of like forcing the American interests, which becomes the most important thing, obviously, of what they're trying to do and accomplish. So there definitely becomes an interesting back and forth with how they approach things at Versailles and how they try to get things done, which I think is really, really interesting. I think it also gets really interesting when you consider things actually got really dire for Franklin. It was one of those things where, there was immediate kind of fervor after the victory at Saratoga and kind of like public support for French involvement, on behalf of the colonists, like was really, really big and was really popular at the time. But kind of as it seemed like the war effort and things were starting to wane, things kind of soured, and it was a struggle kind of for Franklin to seem like he was accomplishing anything. There was some mix up and a lot of just like logistical issues where Franklin would, draw yet another loan, which was important for the colonists, or he would get much needed supplies. But then there were cases where the supplies wouldn't get sent and would be delayed because this ship was supposed to leave at a certain time, and then that changed to leaving at a different time from a different place, or they would end up getting commandeered at sea by the British Navy, all kinds of things like that. And there was a lot of skepticism. And some people just saw Franklin not really being as effective as he essentially could have been. And there were, which is I think also really interesting, because these were multi-person committees that were trying to draw this piece. I think it was really interesting that there were a lot of divisions among them. I mean, mention that Adams kind of had his differences with Franklin, but also like Arthur Lee, and they definitely had some rivalries and some disagreements as well about how they would approach things, so much to the point that Franklin actually did try to issue resignation as minister to the French, which was ultimately denied. But then I did think it was interesting that in the early 1780s they did send John Lawrence, special envoy to the French, to try to see if he could kind of spur some things where Franklin's impacts had kind of stalled, which I think is interesting to note. I don't know that many people know that. Really, Franklin still had already kind of secured the loan that Lawrence gets credit for, but then Lawrence was able to get much needed supplies like out the door, and was able to manage that. And then things kind of shift again when Adams is appointed basically as the sole minister to come up with a peace, essentially with the British. He immediately basically gets into a conflict with Vergennes over the devaluation of continental script, the currency at the time. Again, this just represents that like Adams was very prideful, very venial. He wouldn't back down. He wouldn't give in to, or just like relent on disagreements he had with the French royal ministry, which is something that Franklin was very, very different about. And so ultimately Adams ends up basically having to withdraw, and ends up heading to the Netherlands of his own accord at first to try to strike up a loan that was desperately needed by the Continental Army. And Vergennes very much wanted to write back to the Continental Congress to talk about Adams's conduct and how he vehemently disagreed with what he did and how he did it. And he ended up getting Franklin to also write kind of on his behalf to talk about Adams' conduct and why he left, which is something that Adams would really never forgive Franklin for, and would kind of draw a wedge between them professionally. And Adams really took issue with Franklin from that point on, which I think is interesting. And then from that point, they basically rescinded Adams for being the sole minister to promulgate this treaty. And they appointed, let's see, there were 5 people. They appointed Franklin, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who would not come, John Jay, who was currently the minister to Spain, and then Henry Laurens, but he would get kidnapped. Kidnap is kind of a weird word. He would get captured at sea by the British and would actually get imprisoned in the Tower of London. So he was not present for a lot of the deliberations. So then the book moves into this kind of next phase of negotiating the Treaty of Paris as it comes to be known, and it's principally, again, between Franklin, Adams, and Jay. Adams and Jay kind of they're more like-minded against Franklin and kind of how they want to approach this. Franklin wants to be more delicate. Adams and Jay very much want to push the American interest first and foremost. And actually, the directive from the Congress was that the American committee was supposed to defer to Vergennes and to the French crown and basically work through them to strike up a treaty, which is something that Jay in particular, but also Adams, came to just vehemently disagree with. And they actually went off kind of behind France's back and went straight to the British to get a treaty done and signed. And ultimately Franklin kind of went along with it just because of majority rule. And I think that's kind of an interesting wrinkle too, when you can kind of consider like what France really got out of this alliance to begin with, other than they wanted to humiliate their sole enemy, the British. And it's kind of that tried and true thing of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so I think that's kind of interesting when they ended up really not getting that many considerations out of this treaty in 1783. So, they invested so much into the cause, but really I think they didn't get that much out of it. And what I think is interesting, and one of my favorite parts of the book, is the epilogue, where the author kind of talks about how, because the French ministry took out so many loans to try to finance the war effort, that really set them on the path towards revolution, because this would be like the main contributing factor towards the financial crisis that the royal ministry faced, which ends up basically leading to the French Revolution. And kind of how, if you could think about it, how the Americans really in large part never paid back what they owed the French, essentially. And there would kind of be some tension, but obviously the French Revolution and kind of the changing of the guard in the French government really affects things, and it is just viewed a little bit differently at that point, because the people that struck those alliances kind of were no longer at the center where they once were. So again, I think this is a fascinating time period in history. I think the striking of that diplomacy between the two countries is awesome. I think the title is very apt, A Great Improvisation, because that's frankly what it really was. There kind of was no game plan or guidebook for it. It had to be struck up kind of on the fly, and there were different tactics and methods and opinions on how that kind of stuff should be done. So I think that's very interesting. I found the part specifically on Franklin and his life to be the least interesting part of the book. Again, I think his involvement in French society and in prominent French figures was interesting, but the Times commenting on like his personal life, like his love interests, there was a lot of focus on his son, William Temple, who was basically his secretary all the way through the signing of the Treaty of Paris. I like some of that stuff, but then kind of the talk of his extended family just wasn't as, I was just more so interested in the actual, the actual like growth of the alliance between the French and the Americans and all those ministers and the different opinions and things like that, more so than I was, the actual like stuff on Franklin himself, other than like how he fit into that picture. But Franklin really is considered like the leader of that charge and was the first one that really was able to convince Vergennes and the crown to officially get behind the war effort, especially leading up to that victory at Saratoga. So yeah, I thought this was a great book. It really picked up steam after the 100-page mark. It flows pretty well, but there's definitely a lot of information in there. I think this is a book that I'll definitely revisit at some point in the future, just because, again, I think this alliance and how it comes about is extremely fascinating. But I give this 4 stars, and again, I think when I revisit it, my focus would just be on the specific striking of the alliance and less so on the person, like the individual personal stuff with Franklin and his family. So those are my quick post-read thoughts.